The weight of last words, when a healer needed healing. The silence that followed was different from any Steve Harvey had experienced in his decades of hosting. It wasn't the comfortable pause of anticipation or the brief quiet of surprise. This was the profound silence that follows truth so raw, so devastating, that it strips away every pretense and leaves only the naked reality of human suffering exposed under studio lights. Dr. Isabella Rodriguez stood at the Family Feud podium in her navy blue blazer and crisp white shirt, looking every inch the composed medical professional she had trained herself to be. At 34, she carried herself with the careful precision of someone whose daily decisions meant the difference between life and death. But when Steve's question had pierced through her professional armor, something fundamental had cracked open. "We asked 100 people," Steve had announced with his usual energetic flair. "Name something that keeps you up at night." He'd expected the typical responses that made for good television. Work stress, maybe. Financial worries. Noisy neighbors. The kinds of answers that would light up the board and keep the audience engaged. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez had looked directly into his eyes and delivered 6 words that would transform this episode from entertainment into something approaching ministry. Other people's last words. The studio audience of 300 people fell completely silent, not the polite quiet of a commercial break, but the heavy breathing silence that follows a confession so profound it changes everyone who hears it. Steve's smile didn't fade immediately. It flickered first, like a candle in wind, as his brain processed what she'd said. Then it disappeared entirely as the weight of those words settled over the room. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't in any manual, wasn't part of any show format they'd trained for. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing something that couldn't be scripted. The moment when a game show became a confessional, when entertainment collided with the reality of what some people carry just to serve others. Dr. Isabella Rodriguez had been working in emergency medicine for 8 years, the last 3 of which had been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. She had chosen emergency medicine because she wanted to save lives, to be the person who stood between tragedy and families, to use her skills when they mattered most. What she hadn't anticipated was becoming a collector of final moments, a witness to humanity's last breaths, a keeper of words that would echo in her mind long after the monitors had fallen silent. "Dr. Rodriguez," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. The formality of her title somehow made the moment more respectful, more serious, acknowledging that this woman wasn't just a contestant, but someone whose service deserved recognition. "What do you mean by that?" he asked gently. The question opened floodgates that Isabella had been keeping sealed through months of therapy, meditation, and professional counseling. Her composure, maintained through countless crises and emergencies, began to dissolve. Tears gathered in her dark eyes as she looked out at the studio audience, at people who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to hold space for death on a daily basis. "I mean," she began, her voice barely audible over the studio's sound system, "that every night when I close my eyes, I hear them. Every single person who died in my emergency room, especially during the worst of COVID. Their last words replay in my mind like a broken record. The Rodriguez family, her teammates in this now forgotten game, stood frozen at their positions. Her husband Miguel watched from the family podium with growing concern, recognizing signs he'd seen at home but never in public. Her sister Carmen reached out instinctively, as if to comfort her. But Isabella was lost in a place none of them could follow. "Tell me, Rosa, tell my kids I love them," Isabella continued, as if unable to stop once the words had started flowing. That was Mrs. Martinez, 68 years old, diabetic complications that turned into sepsis. She couldn't breathe, knew she was dying, and all she could think about was making sure her children knew she loved them. The rival family, the Thompson clan from Oregon, stood at their podium with tears forming in their eyes. They'd come for a fun family vacation, expecting laughter and maybe some prize money. Instead, they found themselves witnessing a healthcare worker's trauma being shared with strangers who suddenly understood they were in the presence of someone who had given everything to serve others. Then there was Mr. Chen, Isabella said, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to flow. "Take care of my garden," he whispered. 83 years old, former engineer, spent 40 years growing the most beautiful roses in his neighborhood. He wasn't thinking about his achievements or his legacy. He was thinking about who would water his flowers. Steve found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was recognition of a particular kind of pain that comes from being present for other people's worst moments. Maybe it was the understanding that some jobs require you to carry pieces of other people's souls. "How many?" Steve asked softly, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "In 3 years?" Isabella paused, calculating numbers that shouldn't exist for someone her age. "Directly in my care? Maybe 300. But I was there for the family notifications for probably twice that. Every car accident, every overdose, every heart attack, every COVID death where they couldn't have visitors." The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed loud. Camera operators who had filmed hundreds of tapings found themselves emotionally invested in ways that surprised them. In the control room, producers who usually focused on timing and commercial breaks were reaching for tissues. "Tell my mom I made it home safe," Isabella continued, as if sharing these stories was both torture and relief. That was Jeremy, 19 years old, motorcycle accident. He was more worried about his mother's anxiety than his own injuries, even though we all knew he wasn't going to make it. Steve Harvey, who had built his career on reading people, on understanding what made them laugh or cry or connect with each other, found himself in completely uncharted territory. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was about the cost of compassion, about what happens to people who choose to stand at the intersection of life and death every single day. "Isabella," Steve said, using her first name now, making the connection more personal. "How are you sleeping at night?" "I'm not," she answered immediately, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "I haven't had a full night's sleep in 2 years. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that emergency room, hearing Mrs. Patterson whisper, 'I'm scared,' right before she coded. Or Mr. Williams asking me to pray with him, because he knew he wasn't going to see morning." The audience began to react, not with applause or cheers, but with the soft sounds of recognition and sympathy. Quiet sobs, gentle murmurs, the rustling of tissues being passed between strangers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something sacred. "My husband Miguel," Isabella said, glancing at her family. "He tries to understand. He's a teacher, so he gets what it means to care about people professionally. But he can't understand why I can't just leave work at work. How do I explain that work isn't just a place I go, it's souls I carry?" Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about typical job stress or professional challenges. This was about the spiritual weight of being present for humanity at its most vulnerable moments. About what happens when your calling requires you to absorb other people's pain. "Dr. Rodriguez," Steve said, his voice carrying new weight. "What's the hardest part?" "The hardest part isn't the dying," Isabella said, surprising everyone, including herself. "People think that's what gets to us. But death is natural. The hardest part is the unfinished business. The things people wish they'd said. The relationships they never healed. The dreams they never chased." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue that had materialized from somewhere in the audience. A grandmother in the front row had passed it down, recognizing someone in need of comfort. "I never told Sarah I was proud of her," Isabella continued. That was Mr. Roberts, talking about his daughter, who had just started medical school. He spent his last conscious moments worried that his daughter would become a doctor and never know that her father was proud of her choice. The Thompson family, their competitors in this forgotten game, had abandoned any pretense of competition. Sarah Thompson, a nurse herself, stepped forward slightly, recognizing a kindred spirit in distress. And then I go home, Isabella said. And Miguel asks how my day was. And I want to tell him about Mrs. Yang who died holding her wedding ring, or about the teenager who kept asking if his parents knew he loved them. But how do you share that kind of pain with someone you're trying to protect? Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless stories, but standing there looking at Dr. Isabella Rodriguez, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment value. He saw a healer who needed healing, a caregiver who had forgotten to care for herself. Isabella, Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance quality, when was the last time you felt like yourself? Not Dr. Rodriguez, the emergency physician, but Isabella, the person. The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. She paused, thinking, as if trying to remember a person who used to exist. I don't know, she admitted, and this confession seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. Maybe before the pandemic? I used to paint on weekends. Watercolors, mostly landscapes. But then COVID hit, and suddenly there was no time for anything that wasn't life or death. And you stopped painting, Steve said, understanding flooding his features. I stopped everything, Isabella confirmed. Painting, reading, exercising, calling friends. Everything that made me Isabella instead of Dr. Rodriguez just disappeared. And I told myself it was temporary, that once things calmed down, I'd go back to being myself. But things never calmed down, Steve observed. Things never calmed down, she agreed. And now I don't remember how to be anything, except someone who carries other people's last words. Steve Harvey had built his career on making people laugh, on bringing joy and connection to millions of viewers. But standing there looking at this woman who had given everything to save others, he understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply witness someone's pain and let them know they're not alone. Dr. Rodriguez, Steve said, and now his voice carried the gravity of someone who understood what it meant to serve others. What do you need? The question seemed to break something open in Isabella that had been sealed for years. She looked at Steve, then at her family, then at the audience of strangers who had somehow become witnesses to her unraveling, and spoke a truth she'd never allowed herself to voice. I need to remember that I'm allowed to be human, she said, her voice barely above a whicker. I need to remember that taking care of myself isn't selfish. I need to remember that I can't save everyone, and that doesn't make me a failure. Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, expensive. It represented success, achievement, the kind of professional presence that commanded respect. Isabella, Steve said, draping the jacket around her shoulders. This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows, through moments when I felt strong and moments when I felt broken. But you know what I learned? The jacket was too big for Isabella's frame, but she pulled it tighter around herself as if it were armor against a world that expected her to be invincible. I learned that the people who take care of everyone else deserve to be taken care of too, Steve continued. I learned that strength isn't about carrying everything alone. It's about knowing when to let other people help carry the load. The studio audience began to rise to their feet, not in the typical applause of a game show, but in recognition of something deeper. They were honoring not just Dr. Rodriguez, but every healthcare worker who had sacrificed their own well-being to protect others. You've been carrying other people's last words, Steve said, his voice strong and clear. But what about your own words? What about the words you want to speak while you're still living? Isabella looked up at him, confusion mixing with hope in her eyes. I want to say that it's okay to not be okay, she said, her voice growing stronger. I want to say that healthcare workers are human beings, not superheroes. We break, we cry, we need help, and that doesn't make us weak. Say it louder, Steve encouraged. It's okay to not be okay, Isabella called out, her voice carrying across the studio. We're human beings, not machines. The applause that followed wasn't television applause. It was the sound of recognition, of healing, of hundreds of people who had either lived this experience or loved someone who had, finding their voice through Isabella's courage. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address not just Isabella, but the entire studio, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that some moments transcend entertainment. To every healthcare worker watching this, he said, looking directly into the camera, you are seen, you are valued, and you are allowed to take care of yourselves with the same compassion you show your patients. The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about healing, about permission to be human, about the recognition that those who care for others deserve care in return. Isabella reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo, worn at the edges from handling. It showed a watercolor painting of a sunset over mountains, vibrant oranges and purples bleeding into each other in ways that could only exist in art. This was the last painting I finished, she said, showing it to Steve. 3 years ago, I kept the photo on my desk at the hospital, as a reminder of who I used to be. Steve studied the photo, then looked back at Isabella. Who says you used to be? This person, this artist. She's still in there. She's just been taking care of everyone else. But I don't have time, Isabella protested weakly. You don't have time not to, Steve said firmly. You can't pour from an empty cup, and sweetheart, your cup has been empty for too long. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Isabella. This has my personal number, he said. But more than that, I wrote down the name of someone I want you to call. She's a therapist who specializes in healthcare worker trauma. She helped me when I was struggling with my own demons, and she can help you learn how to carry other people's pain without it destroying you. Isabella took the card with trembling hands. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was permission to seek help, validation that her struggles were real and worthy of attention. The episode aired 3 months later, generating more response than any Family Feud episode in history. Letters poured in from healthcare workers across the country, sharing their own stories of burnout, trauma, and the struggle to maintain their humanity while serving others. The American Medical Association issued a statement acknowledging the mental health crisis among healthcare professionals. Hospital systems began implementing mandatory mental health support for their staff. Medical schools started teaching courses on self-care and emotional resilience, alongside clinical skills. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella's courage in speaking her truth gave permission for thousands of other healthcare workers to admit they were struggling, to seek help, to remember that caring for themselves wasn't selfish, but necessary. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve received a package in the mail. Inside was a watercolor painting of a sunrise, bright yellows and pinks, promising new beginnings. The note attached read, Mr. Harvey, I wanted you to know that I'm painting again. More than that, I'm living again. I still carry other people's last words, but now, I also carry my own voice, my own truth, my own permission to be human. Thank you for reminding me that healers need healing too. The jacket is framed in my office now, next to this painting and a photo of the support group I started for healthcare workers in my city. We meet every Thursday to remember that we're more than our jobs, more than our service, more than the weight we carry. We're human beings who deserve care, compassion, and the chance to create beauty in a world that often feels broken. Today, Dr. Isabella Rodriguez still works in emergency medicine, but she also paints, practices yoga, and leads workshops on healthcare worker wellness. Her office wall features the framed Family Feud episode photo, Steve's business card, and dozens of thank you notes from healthcare workers who found hope in her story. She still hears last words sometimes when she closes her eyes, but now she also hears her own voice, strong and clear, reminding her that she is allowed to be human, allowed to seek help, allowed to create beauty alongside the necessary work of healing others. The weight of last words Isabella learned. is only crushing when you carry it alone. When shared, when witnessed, when held by a community that understands, it becomes something different. Not lighter but more bearable, more meaningful, more connected to the ongoing work of staying human in a profession that requires you to face humanity's most difficult moments. And sometimes the most important words aren't the last ones at all. Sometimes they're the ones that give you permission to keep living, keep creating, keep being the whole person you were meant to be, even while serving others in their darkest hours.